Good evening. In 1931, a notable community gathering took place in Harlem. What unexpected outcomes arose that evening?
Harlem, New York. 11:09 p.m. Friday, March 13th, 1931. The rain was thin and icy, slicing through the street lamps on Lenox Avenue with surgical precision. The sidewalks steamed with cigarette smoke and spilled gin. Inside the back room of the Toscano Social Club, the air was heavier, cigar haze, garlic, sweat, and arrogance. At the center table sat Salvatore Sal Moretti, a mid-tier Italian mob figure with ambitions far above his station, wearing a pinstripe suit that smelled of imported cologne and entitlement. In front of him lay counting trays, manila envelopes, and stacks of cash destined for the 5 families. It was a private meeting, invitation only, except one man decided those rules didn't apply. At 11:12 p.m., without knocking, without a single word of warning, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson pushed open the door and walked in. No entourage, no weapon drawn, no expression. His black overcoat dripped rain onto their polished floor, and for a full 3 seconds no one moved. Then came the violation. Moretti didn't reach for a gun. He reached for a smirk. He glanced at his soldiers, then locked eyes with Bumpy, and delivered the kind of disrespect that echoed through Harlem for years. "Look at that," he said, tapping ash into a tray. The monkey learned to walk upright. Harlem must be real proud. The soldiers laughed in short, nervous bursts. It wasn't just a slur. It was a declaration. In 1931, in that room, he wanted to make Bumpy small, to humiliate him, to remind him this was Little Italy's house, Little Italy's rules, Little Italy's money. Then Moretti finished his insult with a gesture that cut deeper than the words. He flicked a $1 bill toward Bumpy's polished shoes. The bill landed face down, wet with beer, like a tip for a busboy. Bumpy did not pick it up. He did not raise his voice. He did not blink. The silence was predatory. He removed his gloves with systematic precision and set them on the table as if preparing for a legal deposition. Then, calm enough to make the room flinch, he presented his ultimatum. "You owe Harlem 20%. Midnight. No delays, no discounts. That's the last time I explain it." Moretti laughed again, but this time no one else joined him. That was the moment the timeline fractured, because at 11:27 p.m., just 15 minutes later, the Toscano Social Club safe would be empty. Moretti's operation would be compromised, and Harlem would be whispering about a meeting that ended with the Italians paying a debt they swore they'd never recognize. Within 48 hours, Moretti's partners would abandon him. Within 6 weeks, his body would be found in Staten Island, the fingers on his right hand broken systematically, each knuckle shattered with medical precision. In his coat pocket, detectives found a handwritten note. "Respect is not negotiable. Harlem." The story of how Salvatore Moretti lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to March 13th, 1931. Harlem, 1931. The streets were a living organism, pulsing with sweat, ambition, and danger. The jazz age was winding down, leaving behind speakeasies, illicit gin, and the residue of prohibition money. The sidewalks were crowded with pushcarts, brownstones spilling their aromas of fresh bread, coffee, and fried fish into the misty night air. But beneath this rhythm of everyday life, a parallel economy thrived. One ruled not by law, but by respect, fear, and ruthless calculation. And at the center of it, quietly observing, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was 22, but his reputation had already begun to take shape. He was not loud, not flashy. He wore his black overcoat like armor, his fedora tilted just so, and his eyes moved constantly, cataloging every slight, every twitch, every gesture that spoke of disrespect. Harlem had seen a lot in those days. Numbers runners cheated, storefronts burglarized, disputes settled with iron or lead. But Bumpy operated differently. He was methodical, precise, and had a way of making consequences feel inevitable without raising his voice. Meanwhile, Little Italy was in turmoil. Salvatore Sal Moretti was a man who had clawed his way from street corners to mid-tier mob leadership, hungry for recognition and obsessed with his place in the hierarchy. Moretti had style, connections, and a taste for humiliation as a weapon. Harlem's numbers game, which kept entire neighborhoods afloat, had caught his eye, and he wanted in. Not just the money, but the message. To assert dominance over a community he did not belong to prove to his peers that no African-American upstart could challenge Italian control. The first cracks appeared in late February 1931. Small amounts of cash vanished from runners' collections. Envelopes meant to fund Harlem's underground economy appeared in Moretti's hands, but the Italians saw it as harmless leverage rather than theft. One morning, a young runner named Jimmy Slim Carter showed up to Bumpy's doorstep, bruised, shirt ripped, and clutching a tattered ledger. Moretti had insulted him publicly, calling him a half-breed hustler in front of the corner boys, then demanding he hand over the weekly take as a demonstration of loyalty or fear. Bumpy did not shout. He did not lash out. He did not even touch the ledger immediately. He looked at Jimmy's battered face, then at the torn pages, and cataloged every violation, every insult, every dollar stolen. The calculation was precise. Moretti had not just disrespected a man, he had disrespected Harlem itself. And in Bumpy's world, disrespect demanded repayment in full, with interest. Harlem's other operators noticed. Bumpy's name began to circulate beyond his immediate circle. To outsiders, he was just another numbers runner. But the insiders, the ones who understood the unspoken rules, knew he represented a shift. Where others might respond with rage or guns, Bumpy responded with patience, observation, and the cold promise of retribution. He became the embodiment of a principle that had no tolerance for arrogance, respect is earned, and anyone who undermined it would face consequences they could not calculate. By early March, the pattern was clear. Moretti's crew was overreaching, emboldened by their perception of racial hierarchy and territorial entitlement. They believed Harlem's men were soft, that their numbers could be skimmed with impunity. Bumpy watched silently from shadowed doorways, cafes, and back alleys. He began assembling a plan that was as simple as it was brutal. A single visit, a single statement, and a lesson that would echo for decades. And that's how Harlem, in the early hours of March 13, 1931, became a stage for one of the most audacious acts of territorial enforcement in organized crime history. The city had fed the wolves, but one wolf had learned to walk upright, and he was about to show the predators that hunger was only the beginning. Harlem, 1931. It was the kind of night that smelled of wet asphalt, cheap cologne, and cigar smoke. A storm had passed hours earlier, leaving streets slick, reflecting the flickering gaslights. On 135th Street, the corner boys knew something was about to happen. The rumor had spread, Salvatore Sal Moretti had gone too far. But no one knew just how far. The target of his arrogance was Jimmy Slim Carter, Bumpy's runner, a wiry 20-year-old who had been loyal since he could count numbers on paper. That afternoon, Moretti had decided to make an example of him, choosing the busiest corner, in front of the pushcart vendors, laundry women, and men finishing their drinks. Moretti's soldiers surrounded Slim, pinching him against the lamppost like a rag doll. Then Moretti leaned in, his breath smelling of garlic and liquor, and spat words meant to humiliate. "Look at this little monkey," he said. "Think you run numbers for Harlem? You're lucky we don't hang you from this pole right now. Your neighborhood won't know respect if it hits him in the face." The words hit Slim like ice. People nearby gasped. A few tried to intervene, but Moretti's men shoved them back with brutal efficiency. One soldier cracked Slim's jaw with a gloved hand, snapping the bone with precise force. The ledger he carried, the weekly tally of numbers from Harlem's corners, was ripped from his grasp and tossed onto the wet pavement, soaking instantly. Moretti stepped on it, grinding the pages beneath his polished shoe. Every number smeared, every name smudged, every bit of Harlem's underground economy disrespected in a single theatrical gesture. Slim staggered back, trembling. His loyalty had been tested and his pride humiliated. He looked toward the shadows where Bumpy often lingered, a faint hope burning in his eyes. Bumpy, however, did not move, not a muscle, not a hand, not a flinch. He observed, cataloging every detail. The sneer, the hand gestures, the way Moretti's soldiers laughed too early, too nervously. Every slight would be remembered. Every insult would be repaid. By the time Moretti and his men left, laughing and smirking as if Harlem itself had accepted their authority, the neighborhood was buzzing. "Did you see that?" whispered a street vendor. "They humiliated him right here in front of everyone," another added, and Bumpy, he didn't even flinch. Bumpy's silence was deliberate. In his world, the absence of reaction was louder than any scream. It was the calm before the storm, the promise of a response that would not only restore respect but annihilate the arrogance that dared to disrespect Harlem's men. He would not attack the soldiers. He would not shout at Moretti. Instead, he would engineer a response that was disproportionate, systematic, and indelible, a lesson engraved in both financial ruin and fear. The first step was intelligence. Bumpy moved quietly through Harlem's streets, speaking to trusted allies, counting numbers, observing Moretti's operations. Every safe, every ledger, every soldier's weakness was noted. The insult at 135th Street was not just a personal attack, it was a threat to the entire community. And Bumpy, as always, treated threats with precision. By late evening, the plan crystallized. A single visit, a single confrontation, and the lesson would be delivered without chaos, without unnecessary noise, without public spectacle. The key was timing. Harlem's clockwork economy had deadlines, and Bumpy's understanding of those hours was as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. The final reckoning would come at midnight, in a place Moretti thought was safe, in a room he thought secure. And so, the streets of Harlem waited. They didn't know the exact hour, but they knew the moment was near. The insult had been heard, the challenge issued, and the silent observer was ready to walk into enemy territory alone. Little Italy, 1931. March 13th, 11:03 p.m. The streets were narrow, wet, and pungent with the smell of tomato sauce, garlic, and coal smoke. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light, glinting off puddles and the slick shoes of men who had spent the evening drinking or counting cash. Every shadow seemed to move, every window hid eyes, every corner held the promise of betrayal. It was territory that Harlem men were not meant to cross. But Bumpy Johnson had never been one to respect unspoken rules. He stepped off the last Harlem stoop and onto Mulberry Street. His overcoat, heavy and black, glistened with raindrops. His hat tilted just enough to shield his eyes from the street lights, but his gaze was fixed on the destination, the Toscano Social Club. Inside, Moretti would be surrounded by his soldiers, counting envelopes of cash, confident in his authority, confident that Harlem's laws did not apply here. Bumpy's entrance was calculated. No knocking, no hesitation. Just the push of the heavy oak door, slick with rainwater, and the hiss of leather soles against polished floorboards. In the back room, Moretti's crew looked up from their counting, their cigars frozen mid-smoke. At the head of the table, Moretti himself, pinstripes pressed, tie loose, arrogance in every line of his posture, noticed the figure in the doorway. And then Moretti made the mistake that would seal his fate. He laughed. He leaned back, puffed cigar smoke in Bumpy's direction, and said, loud enough for the soldiers to hear, Look at that. The monkey from Harlem wants to play with the big boys. He tapped a dollar bill against the table, sliding it toward Bumpy like a tip for a waiter. The soldiers chuckled nervously, some shuffling their chairs, others gripping the handles of hidden weapons. Bumpy did not flinch. He did not move. He did not speak. For 3 heartbeats he simply stared. His silence was a weapon, heavier than any iron rod in the room. Moretti's smirk faltered slightly, an imperceptible shift, but Bumpy noticed. Every detail mattered. Then Bumpy did something almost ceremonial. He removed his gloves, folding them carefully and placing them on the table, as if preparing for an examination rather than a confrontation. And then, calm and precise, he delivered his ultimatum. You owe Harlem 20%. Midnight, no delays, no discounts. That's the last time I explain it. The room froze. Moretti's laughter died in his throat. His soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain, wary. Bumpy's tone carried no anger, no threat that could be bargained with. It was law, inevitability. He did not raise his voice. The power in his words was measured, unstoppable. Moretti tried to regain control. He barked orders, gestured to his men to retrieve weapons. But Bumpy had already walked toward the door, rain dripping from his coat, eyes fixed on the streets outside. The room, once full of arrogance, was left trembling. By the time Bumpy hit the streets again, Moretti's mind was racing. The ultimatum was clear, precise, and humiliating in its simplicity. Harlem had spoken. Respect demanded repayment. And in Bumpy Johnson's world, repayment would not be messy. It would be methodical, surgical, and devastating. That night, Moretti's soldiers would sit in silence, realizing they had underestimated a man who walked into a lion's den alone, left unscathed, and carried with him the promise of a reckoning that would leave no room for error. Toscano Social Club, Little Italy, March 13, 1931, 11:27 p.m. The rain had stopped, leaving a metallic chill in the air that seeped into the bones of anyone daring enough to linger outside. Inside, the pinstripe suits and polished shoes of Moretti's crew seemed sharper, more confident. Yet none noticed the soft, deliberate click of a lock opening in the back hallway. Bumpy Johnson moved like a shadow, a man invisible in plain sight, carrying the patience of months and the precision of a surgeon. He had spent days mapping the operation, every envelope, every safe combination, every schedule. Harlem had whispered its secrets to him, who watched the numbers runners, who flipped coins on which backdoor deals, who could be swayed with threats or promises. Tonight, the ledger would balance, but not in the way Moretti expected. 11:29 p.m. Bumpy stepped into the safe room. Moretti's loyalist, a jittery Italian named Vito, had been bribed hours earlier with a simple note: keep Harlem's respect in mind, or lose your fingers. Fear, not force, had moved Vito's hands for him. He turned the dials without question. 11:33 p.m., the safe clicked. Cash, bonds, and envelopes, the wealth Moretti thought untouchable, lay exposed. Bumpy's hands moved swiftly, systematically transferring stacks into a bag lined with leather. Each bundle was counted, verified, and logged in his mind for redistribution. He left nothing to chance. No coin was misplaced. Every piece of Moretti's arrogance was catalogued for repayment. 11:43 p.m. Bumpy left a note on the safe's top shelf, where Moretti would find it hours later. Respect is not negotiable. Harlem. 11:45 p.m. Back on the streets, the bag of envelopes was delivered with surgical precision. Numbers, runners, and neighborhood elders received their portions. Back pay for the insult, funds to secure the community's economy, and enough left over to signal that Bumpy Johnson's reach was absolute. Harlem had been wronged, Harlem had been repaid, and Moretti's pride, the true currency of organized crime, had been humiliated. The soldiers inside the club realized the theft almost simultaneously with Moretti, who had been pacing, cigar in hand, oblivious to the shift in power. His orders were meaningless. His men frozen with disbelief within moments. Whispers of Bumpy's audacity traveled from the club to the streets, to the other Italian crews, to anyone with ears in the neighborhood. The man from Harlem had not only crossed into enemy territory alone, he had systematically dismantled their operation in under 20 minutes. Moretti's mind raced. Calls were made to allies, threats were issued, and soldiers scrambled to recover the cash. But the network had already shifted. Every envelope, every dollar had vanished into the veins of Harlem's underground economy, carried away by men loyal to Bumpy. The Italian mob was left with nothing but humiliation, the bitter taste of underestimation, and the cold realization that Harlem had one ruler they could not intimidate. By midnight, the club was empty except for Moretti, his pride shattered, and a note that would haunt him. Outside, Harlem's streets remained alive with jazz, chatter, and rain-slick reflections. But underneath it all, a silent victory had been won. Bumpy Johnson had proven that disrespect carried consequences, calculated with precision, executed without emotion, and witnessed by every corner of the neighborhood. Little Italy, early March 1931. The morning after the theft, the streets were unusually quiet, a low hum of tension replacing the usual clatter of carts and voices. Salvatore Sal Moretti woke to a nightmare that had no name yet, only the feeling of vulnerability, an intangible but crushing weight pressing from every direction. He had thought he ruled these streets with cunning and fear. He had not anticipated Bumpy Johnson. By 6:12 a.m., the first signs of collapse appeared. Soldiers loyal to Moretti arrived at the club only to find it empty, safe looted, ledgers gone, and a single note lying where it could not be missed. Respect is not negotiable. Harlem. Panic spread quietly. One by one, men who had sworn allegiance began to doubt their leader. They whispered in the shadows, weighing loyalty against survival. Within hours, Moretti's network of extortion partners, small-time operators, and loan collectors began to fracture. By 9:03 a.m., word had reached the upper echelons of Moretti's Italian contacts. The audacity of a single Harlem man walking into Little Italy and walking out with their wealth was unthinkable. They demanded restitution, accountability, and proof of loyalty. Moretti's assurances sounded hollow. No proof could reverse the humiliation. The message had traveled far faster than the stolen envelopes ever could. Allies who had once laughed at Harlem's men now viewed Bumpy as a predator with cold, surgical precision. Meanwhile, Harlem buzzed with whispered admiration. Bumpy's careful redistribution of the funds had ensured that the insult to Jimmy Slim Carter became an opportunity for the neighborhood. Numbers runners received back pay, elders were compensated for prior skims, and every dollar that left Moretti's hands was strategically rerouted to strengthen Harlem's underground economy. Respect had been restored, and the Italians' humiliation was documented in every transaction. By 1:17 p.m., Moretti's desperation escalated into reckless behavior. He attempted to intimidate street operators, sending threats by runners, hiring small-time enforcers to reclaim lost cash, and attempting to bribe the local police with promises of cooperation that only emphasized his vulnerability. But every move Bumpy had already anticipated. Surveillance, bribery, and intimidation from Harlem's protectors neutralized each attempt systematically. Every contact Moretti had counted on now either refused him or turned against him quietly, fearful of Harlem's retaliation. By 5:43 p.m., Moretti's men were leaving his side. Soldiers he thought loyal quietly slipped away, returning to Little Italy's back streets or Harlem's corners to report on the state of the operation. Each defection was precise, timed to maximize panic. By sunset, Moretti was alone, his credibility shattered, his finances compromised, and his alliances fractured. Harlem's shadow had grown long and impossible to ignore. Bumpy's strategy had been brutal in its subtlety. There had been no shouting, no gunfire, no public spectacle, just the systematic unraveling of a man who had underestimated the quiet authority of respect enforced with precision. Little Italy had not been conquered with weapons. It had been dismantled with strategy, patience, and the cold certainty of inevitability. By nightfall, Moretti was forced to consider his only option, a secret meeting, isolated and controlled, to fix everything. But Bumpy had already anticipated it. In Harlem, the whispers carried far beyond the streets. His reputation as the man who could cross territories, take what was owed, and leave without a scratch was cemented. The collapse of Moretti's operation was complete, and Harlem had found a protector who enforced respect with brutal efficiency. Staten Island, 1931, March 21st, 3:44 a.m. The night was dense, thick with fog rolling off the water, carrying the scent of salt, coal, and diesel. The boathouse was isolated, abandoned except for the creak of old timbers and the occasional drip of water from a leaky roof. Salvatore Sal Moretti arrived first, shivering in his pinstripe coat, fumbling with the edges of his gloves, trying to convince himself that this meeting could repair the damage, but deep down he knew it was a trap. Every instinct screamed that Harlem had moved faster than he ever imagined. Bumpy Johnson arrived shortly after, accompanied not by shouting or gunfire, but by the silent shadows of his most trusted men. He did not speak, did not raise his hands, did not flinch. He surveyed the room, noting the cracks in Moretti's posture, the twitch of his eyes, the desperation in his voice before he even spoke. The atmosphere was precise, methodical, a courtroom without a judge, where the verdict had already been written. Moretti stammered, trying to negotiate, to bargain, to appeal to whatever Italian pride remained. "We can fix this. Split the difference." "Give you," Bumpy interrupted, calm, cold, and deliberate. "Your time is up. You were given a warning, and you failed. Respect has consequences." Then the execution began, not with fire, but with calculated brutality. Bumpy's men moved with precision, each strike intentional, each injury symbolic. Moretti's right hand was immobilized first, fingers broken one by one, the sound of snapping bone echoing in the empty boathouse. Not a scream escaped, only the metallic snap, a brutal rhythm of inevitability. Every fracture carried a message: disrespect is not tolerated. At 4:12 a.m., the work was done. Moretti lay on the floor, disfigured, humiliated, and fully aware that his empire, such as it had been, was dismantled. In his coat pocket, Bumpy placed the final statement of authority, a handwritten note: "Respect is not negotiable, Harlem." It was brief, brutal, and absolute. A single line that would echo through both neighborhoods, through every gambler, numbers runner, and mob associate who ever doubted Harlem's reach. By 4:30 a.m., Bumpy and his men had vanished. The boathouse was left in silence, the fog swallowing footprints, the water lapping against the pilings as if nothing had happened. But in the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward. Moretti's allies abandoned him entirely. Protection was withdrawn, funds frozen, operations collapsed. Harlem flourished quietly, its underground economy stabilized, its people protected, its reputation reinforced. Bumpy Johnson emerged not as a criminal in the traditional sense, but as a community enforcer, a man whose cold, detached authority demanded respect without theatrics. Moretti's failure became a lesson written in bone and paper, whispered across two neighborhoods for decades. In a world ruled by fear and money, Bumpy had proven that intelligence, patience, and precision could dismantle an empire more effectively than bullets ever could. Harlem remembered. Little Italy remembered. and Bumpy Johnson's legend, forged in silence and executed with surgical efficiency, became untouchable.